of a hate crime and a public lynching by shotgun in Brunswick, Georgia. Over 2 months before the video became public, a father and a son filled with racism and a despicable and misguided understanding of humanity chased Ahmaud Arbery as he was jogging and shot him in cold blood on the street. We were shocked, we were outraged, and unfortunately, we were not surprised. We've seen it before. On May 25th, once again, videos of another lynching surfaced, and we watched as police officers provided support and cover to one of their colleagues who pressed his knee into the neck of George Floyd and slowly choked the life from his being, despite his cries for his mother and his pleas of, "I can't breathe." It is clear that we have a systemic problem of institutional racism in our culture that continues to deteriorate the soul of our being from the inside out, while endangering and destroying the lives of African Americans every day. I saw a political cartoon this week that had a picture of an iceberg, and the iceberg was entitled Racism. And the very tip of the iceberg that was showing was highlighted as the racism that you see on video. And how true it is. An NPR interview this week, an interviewer proposed a question about what we could do. And the response to the question was, what if we saw institutional racism in our culture as threatening to our lives as the coronavirus pandemic? How would that change the way that we found our vigilance and our passion and our use of resources to do something about it? June is Compassion Month for the UUA, and we will be focusing throughout this month on ways that we are called to be a compassionate people at the UUCC. And I believe that compassion begins with opening our eyes to the images of oppression and suffering around us. It is the power of making something visible. You know, no arrests were made in Brunswick, Georgia, until the video of the lynching of Ahmaud Arbery circulated around the world, and the world demanded action. And I wonder, without video footage of George Floyd's death, I wonder, would his death have even been noticed? Compassion begins when we decide to open our eyes to the pain and the oppression and the suffering around us, and let those images dive into our being, past our eyes, into our heart, into our soul. During the Civil War, Matthew Brady and a team of photographers began to capture images of the death and carnage in the aftermath of battles. They originally started taking pictures of various parts of the war and attempt to provide material and provide information for those who were designing battlefield strategy. What eventually happened is they started taking pictures of the aftermath of battles, those dead soldiers lying in the grass in various fields on both sides of the war. And after one of the bloodiest battles in the war, the Battle of Antietam, the New York Times printed an article on October 20th, 1862, and it reads, "Mr. Brady has done something to bring home to us the terrible reality and earnestness of war. If he has not brought bodies and laid them in our dooryards and along our streets, then he has done something very like it." The images of the dead bodies piled up began to change the understanding of the war and undermine the heart and soul of even the Confederate cause, at least for those who were still connected to their sense of internal humanity. We also know that if you have been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., or seen some of those images, the images of shoes piled up, and eyeglasses collected, and mass graves were the greatest threat to Hitler's sociopathic attempt to exterminate Jewish people from the earth as if they were a plague. And it pulled back the curtain and let us realize that the true plague was the pool of hate and bigotry in his heart that deepened inside of him and then spread throughout Germany. National Geographic magazine began a concept in an era of what is called photojournalism, and they published several editions of images from the war in Vietnam. And when our eyes began to process the images of what was happening on the other side of the world, the sentiment around the war changed, and the small group of protesters grew, and those who were still connected to their sense of internal humanity began to demand change. Many have been able also to paint pictures with their words and allow us to see things with just their use of words and poetry. Harriet Beecher Stowe so poetically pulled the curtain back and showed us true life on a southern plantation. The British poet Wilfred Owen opened our eyes to the treachery of World War I. Listen to his words. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the frost-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongue. Compassion begins when we open our eyes, whether we see images on video, whether we see photos, or we become aware with the use of words and language of the images of suffering around us. Compassion begins when we decide to open our eyes and see that suffering around us, to look at it. Compassion begins when we refuse to not turn a blind eye to suffering and injustice, when we refuse to lean into privilege and connect to the discomfort and pain and fear. The word compassion etymologically simply means to be joined and connected to suffering. In the Greek language, the word for suffering is also used to describe a rut or a ditch. So the word compassion in the Greek literally means to be joined with a rut, to crawl in and become one with a ditch. And for us, there is no other way to navigate this in our culture than to choose to crawl into the rut and be joined with compassion to those who are suffering around us. We can no longer sit in safety and comfort and claim to be compassionate people. We are called to be people of compassion, believing deeply in the inherent dignity and worth of all human beings, and understanding our interconnectedness to the web of existence around us. We have to feel deeply connected to the suffering around us, believing, as Dr. King said, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The videos that we saw in May of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, the story reported of Breonna Taylor being gunned down in her home, they make us angry. But it is not enough to be angry. We have felt the indictment of our own silence, and we have spoken out in protest. But we can do more, because it's not enough to speak out in voices of protest. We can have confessed our own feelings of bias and subtle racism that lives in our heart. And that is good and helpful to be vulnerable in our culture and courageous, but we can do more. It's not enough to commit verbally to awareness and change. When the Black Lives Matter movement invites us to speak the names, we must read them aloud as if they were our closest family members, as if we were standing over the graves of our sons and our daughters, our brothers and our sisters, our mothers and our fathers. We must feel the shotgun barrel on our skin and let the image from Brunswick, Georgia explode through our gut, causing our blood to soak into the asphalt of the street that was once our jogging path. We must feel the knee on our neck on the Minneapolis street and gasp for breath and cry for our mother, and let our dying moments feel the weight and pain of every person who has sworn an oath to serve and protect us. When we get into the ditch with the virus and the plague, then we will know that it is actually killing us all. History has its eyes on us in this moment. I look around us and I find so many reasons to be hopeless, to dissolve into despair, and feel like nothing will ever change. Voices of hope pierce through the shadows, though, and we'll have a chance to hear one of those in a couple of minutes from a young man named Kedron Bryant, who gives voice and music to poetry written by his mother. And I find hope in this gathering of this community, the UUCC. For in this place, I find a group of people who are willing to crawl into the ditch and experience true compassion. I find a group of people who refuse to turn a blind eye, who refuse to remain silent, who choose to be authentic and vulnerable, who risk the messiness of anxiety-filled conversations, who put themselves in harm's way to stand side by side with those who are in danger. I find hope in this place. And as your minister, I covenant with you today to do all I can to do my part to keep the flame of our chalice burning brightly. Our compassion, our love, our desire for justice can change our world around us. It can make a difference. You and I can stand against the viruses that threaten our lives and create a new and a hopeful world, for we are the UUCC.
Our closing song today is performed